was established right at the beginning of Edison's 4 phases, in the capacity phase. And part of what Edison liked to do was to work with small teams first. And you heard conversations today from Scott and from others, from Bob, about communication. Scott talked about the connection between communication and collaboration. This is one of the very first foundational baselines that needs to exist. Having teams that can talk with each other, that can exchange information rapidly, and with a high degree of trust. Now, the name of my book, Midnight Lunch, actually came from a practice that Edison established in his laboratories to invite this, to create this kind of exchange. A midnight lunch took place after work hours, about 7 o'clock. Occasionally, Edison would come back to the laboratory after having dinner with his family, and he'd check in on his experiments, see how they were faring. He would then talk with the other employees who were also in the lab, some 10 or 12 people who might also be staying late, and he'd see what they were working on. He'd look at their experiments, and then he would insist that all of the people would exchange notebooks with each other. So through doing this, people got to get a sense of what others were working on and share expertise. Some people might be working on sound. Some people might be working on electrical power. Some people might be working on motion and how the eye perceives motion. These are very different areas of understanding, but in a midnight lunch, Edison had everybody share their thinking. So today we can share files electronically, but in Edison's time he wanted people to physically be able to read and see what the assumptions were. What was the thought process that was going into an experiment? After doing this for about 2 hours, Edison would order in food for everyone. So there would be sandwiches and beverages. They would sit back, tell stories, sing songs for about an hour, and just have fun. So this was the time when they got to know each other as people. Then they would go back to work for a few hours and leave the laboratory about midnight. So this was a very unique combination of social time and work time. There was no agenda. There wasn't, well, this needs to last 10 minutes, this will last 20 minutes, we need to be out of here in an hour. There was dialogue, open dialogue, and sharing of insights. So a midnight lunch became an opportunity for people to actually share their knowledge. It was a time when employees were transformed into colleagues. When you work in an environment where you feel like a colleague, you're going to share more. You're going to bring your insights. And this is part of what you can begin to create, is a sense of collegiality in your organization. As you work on a project team, as you look at a solution, you can begin to bring forward some of these ideas and just discuss them and debate them. It creates sort of an invisible glue for the capacity of collaboration to exist. Phase 2, context. This is another area that distinguishes Edison's form of collaboration from how his competitors were operating. A lot of times, our first notion is to jump in and think that we have the answer. When we see a challenge, when we see a problem, some of our first impulse is to put some options out on the table. And there's nothing wrong with this. There's nothing wrong with having an idea, formulating a hypothesis of what might be an answer, and making note of that. What Edison liked to do was to actually begin with questions. What is it that we're trying to solve? Someone may have sent an email, someone may have said, okay, here's what I want you guys to be looking at. Okay, let's step back and look at this problem. What is the question here? What are we trying to do? And when there's discussion around the questions first, often there can be more alignment around the possible solutions. This is where Edison was able to accelerate his collaboration process. A lot of times we don't think that it might be faster to begin with questions rather than to begin with ideas or solutions. But you can see, $6.7 billion in 40 years is pretty good. So there was an efficiency to this process that was unique. Edison wanted people to be prepared when they came to their collaboration discussions. They needed to have done some reading, have a point of view when they came together. And this created richness of dialogue. So the questions, the dialogue was part of a very distinct way of operating. You can look at some of the questions that I found in Edison's notebooks, and we might think of these almost as childish questions. As he was looking at the process of incandescence, how to actually create a light source that would be safe and that could be long burning, he was asking, how do substances burn? Now, people had been trying to conquer incandescence for 40 years before Edison began his efforts to conquer it. And as he was looking through the experiments, he was looking through all the scientific documentation, he said, you know what? I can't ask the same question that my predecessors did because I'll end up in the same place. If I ask the same question and I approach the problem the same way, I'm going to end up with solutions that look like theirs did, which didn't yield anything. So actually, I need to start with a different question. You can see some questions here about motion. This is partly how Edison began his work with photography and looking at individual images to try to figure out how could he stream these images together. Well, he needed to understand, how does the eye perceive motion? So we might not begin with questions like this, but this is what I would urge you to begin thinking about. Begin with questions rather than jumping in right away with solutions. Part of the distinguishing factor of collaboration versus teamwork is a sense of discovery. If we have a task orientation, we aren't going to be open to hearing something new or to receiving an insight that could actually shift the pattern of how thinking is progressing. Discovery learning is part of collaboration. And this is also where we start to see speed. We don't all work the same way. We aren't all wired to be verbal, to engage with people in dialogue. Sometimes we would rather think and sit and be more reflective. And you can see this at work in Edison's laboratory. Some of the people who were working in Edison's labs were the prototypers. They were the people who were developing the drawings, the people who were putting the ideas into visual form. So whatever way you want to engage in these kinds of dialogue, you can create that. It can be part of your discovery. Think about how you can actually engage in dialogue, whether it's verbally, whether it's through a hand drawing, whether it's through even taking a video clip of something and say, here's something that I saw that reminded me of the challenge that we're facing, and here's what I see in this situation. This is a part of discovery learning. Phase 3, coherence. It's great to have teams. It's great to undertake in a project that's going to take months and months at a time. But one of the challenging things is, how do you keep a team together? There are issues. There are challenges. The client changes a spec. The funding shifts. There's a movement in the regulatory environment. Very important to think about the context of what's happening from the perspective of the glue of the team. How do we keep a team together? One of the most important things I saw at work in Edison's laboratory was the notion of catalysts. You know, Edison was a genius. That's certain. But he could not have run his operation if he didn't also have people who were giving their best thoughts and insights. These people I call catalysts. There were a number of people in the laboratory that sprang up, some of whom Edison groomed, but others who just appeared as leaders within the broader sphere of his employees. And these catalysts had some unique qualities. They were collegial. They were people who invited others to participate, to listen to ideas, and to also contribute their own ideas. They were inspiring. They had a sense of mission and purpose about what they were doing. They were optimistic. You heard Lionel talk about speaking in the negative. What if we make a mistake? What if this doesn't work? What if people don't like this? A catalyst is someone who actually is going to be thinking in the positive. We can do this. Let's wrestle with this. Let's talk about this and get some more perspective. And moving people in a positive vein. And finally, each of these catalysts had an area of expertise. They had what I would call a long suit, something that they were really good at. They had a sweet spot that they could share with people, but that they wanted to expand. They wanted to learn something more. So these catalysts were people who created momentum in the laboratory. This is something that you can think about as you work on projects, as you're out in the field. Can you be a catalyst? Can you take some of your expertise? Can you share that? Can you draw other people into a discussion about what you're doing, frame it in a positive way, and invite people to share their thinking? This is a fundamental way to think about progress. There was some conversation this morning about being transparent, about recognizing things that weren't working, as well as things that are working. Now, as a leader in your industry, there are clearly a lot of things that are working. And part of how you can continue to be a leader in a more competitive environment is to think about how are you defining progress. Yes, we want to define progress as 4% growth year on year, as expanding the amount of transmission line, as bringing new kinds of electrical power on stream. But also, what about, are we communicating more rapidly? Are we sharing insights in more depth? Are we bridging some of the distance between geographies? Do we have people who are actually encouraging some of this dialogue? Some of those are the qualitative sides of what constitutes progress. So think about how you define that. How do you define progress within your own team? Edison was very, very focused on having teams own their goals, not just having him define them. Because there's a greater sense of engagement, a greater sense of being informed, a greater sense of connection and innovation that flows when the team owns their goals. And finally, the fourth phase of collaboration, complexity. There's tremendous complexity in the environment that you're dealing with today. You have new competitive frameworks that are coming into play. Scott talked about EPC and ways of putting teams together, ways of communicating within your organization to partners outside your group, people who are supplying what you do, who are offering resources and materials to you, new ways of being able to engage with these individuals and groups. Now, smart devices accelerates this. The presence of smart devices in the field, the presence of smart devices in your client organizations, this is speeding the process dramatically, and that adds complexity. So as you think about what you do, think about how you can begin to streamline the number of steps. Are there ways that you can create communication flows that don't have you doing 6 touches instead of maybe 2 or 3 as you're working through a problem? Think about ways of streamlining. Edison was always doing this. And part of what he wanted to do in this process was to tap the collective intelligence of his employee base. Who might know something about this? Who could I contact that would actually have some understanding of this issue? Could I bring some of that learning to this conversation, to this issue? So a sense of the collective intelligence of the organization is very important for your success as you continue forward. Thinking about the different geographies. You heard from all the different leaders across the country this morning. Thinking about what knowledge do they have that I might be able to use as I'm solving a problem. Edison was very cognizant of this and really focused on collective intelligence as a unique footprint. Collaboration drives the innovation process. Collaboration for Edison was the on-ramp to these industries that he launched. If he had not been able to collaborate, he would not have been able to create the speed and effectiveness that distinguished him as a competitor. If he had not asked different questions, He would not have been able to probe new insights. So you have the opportunity to make a difference. You have an opportunity to make a difference in how you communicate, how you operate as a team player, how you think about the challenges and the questions that are in front of you. Be willing to roll up your sleeves. Be willing to be a colleague and share your best thinking. Be willing to discover. Recognize that in this new environment where you're going to be having competitive bidding going on for projects that would normally just fall to you, you are going to need to discover and learn, create new competencies. Think about how you're going to ask questions, ask new questions, think about things differently than you have in the past. Questions are a great way to ramp yourself into this. Owning your goals. I talked about Edison's ability to have people create a sense of motivation, connection, and purpose by owning their own goals. Even if you get objectives that are given to you, you can still create some of your own objectives too. How can you push for that maximum potential that Lionel talked about? How can you go beyond your best into a completely new level of performance? And finally, sharing your insights. There are people here who have been doing what they're doing for 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. You have insights that are unique. You have ways of thinking that can be brought into a new perspective and a new context. All of this is part of collaboration. All of this is what can create you being revved and ready for what's next. Thank you so much.